Hello and welcome. This episode features an interview with WWF Australia's Kesaya Baba, who is leading the Environment Group's delegation to COP29 in Baku. I found it inspiring, and I'll keep her answer to the last question of the interview firmly in my mind as I cover this COP. And I suggest that anyone who is deeply demoralised by the state of play at the moment do the same. Kesaya talks about her goals at this COP and about the future. In the short term, COP31, which is likely to be in Australia and the Pacific in 2026, and then the ultimate goal of limiting temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees. After the interview with Kesaya, we go straight into a talk with Mark Tilley, the insightful Asia-Pacific editor of international news service Carbon Pulse. Mark talks about the ramifications of the US election for this COP, which are significant. Mark also talks about crucial negotiations at the COP on a new international financial pledge, known in COP jargon as the New Collective Quantified Goal, or NCQG. In addition, Mark talks about discussions at the COP about international cooperation on climate change using carbon markets. These are known in COP jargon as Article 6 measures because they're dealt with in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. In terms of Trump's impact, personally I think it's worth making 2 points. Firstly, negotiators must have prepared for this. It's not the result that those wanting climate change action had hoped for. But there is no way that seasoned negotiators would have planned for these talks without a plan B for how they would approach things if the Democrats lost. Secondly, I noticed a headline when I was preparing this intro which said, "There's only one story in Baku," referring to Trump's victory. With all due respect to the sub-editor that dreamt up that line, that's completely untrue. There are many, many thousands of stories here in Baku, and most of them are really positive. Okay, let's get started. I'm talking to Kesaya Baba from Environment Group WWF Australia. Kesaya is WWF Australia's Senior Manager of COP31 Strategy. You heard me correctly, Kesaya's day job focus is COP31, which is 2 years away and is likely to be held in Australia and the Pacific. Kesaya is Fijian-Australian and a passionate climate and human rights advocate, with experience in climate diplomacy and international development. She also has a master's in youth development. Before joining WWF, Kesaya held roles including Senior Policy Advisor at the National Emergency Management Agency and COP26 Climate Change Attaché at the British Embassy in Bangkok. She is a proud feminist and a member of the Women's Climate Congress. I guess first up, Kesaya, and welcome. Could you tell us about this COP31 role that you have with WWF and about your personal journey to this role?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation as we head into COP29. Yes, the role of COP31 as lead at WWF Australia came up about a year ago, and it's really in preparation and hopeful anticipation that Australia will host COP31 in 2026 in partnership with the Pacific. So Australia has bid to host the COP and specified that they will do it in partnership with the Pacific. There's a lot to do to prepare for the event that it does come to our part of the world. And so we're working on preparing particularly civil society and community. So working with the Australian climate movement as well as WWF's partners to get ready, really, and build capacity, create relationships across sectors, and really prepare for that happening. And that work is also really useful even if the COP doesn't come to Australia and the Pacific. So it's kind of a win-win when you have stronger relationships it's always better in terms of community and civil society outcomes as well. And in terms of my personal journey, as you mentioned, I come from Fiji. So my personal journey has really started from my childhood and even before that. In a way, I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors as well. And in fact, my father was at the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit that was really gave birth to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which has then subsequently given us COPs and the Paris Agreement. And so Dad was one of the first official Indigenous peoples delegations to the United Nations. So building on that, I have worked in development, in international development in the Pacific, and also a little bit in Southeast Asia. And then I was lucky when I was working in Thailand to get a job working for the British Embassy in Bangkok as their COP26 climate change attaché, as you mentioned. So it's that was really working to support the embassy in their climate change, their climate diplomacy in the lead up to COP26. So working with partners to encourage Thailand to go to COP26 in Glasgow with improved targets for their emissions. And we were ultimately successful in that, and along with partners in the Thai government and others, for Thailand to come with a much stronger target to COP26, and that was a really wonderful thing to be a part of. And so when I saw that Australia was bidding to host a COP in partnership with the Pacific, it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to work with WWF and do a similar thing, but working with civil society.
Thanks, Kesaya. It's a wonderful achievement to have been able to help convince a country to take a more ambitious target to COP26. But it's a particularly wonderful story also about your father, to have that shared or that deep extended family commitment to taking action on climate change and broader sustainability issues. Can I ask you the benefits of Australia and the Pacific hosting COP31? Why would that be important for the region, do you think?
It's a really huge opportunity if COP comes to the Pacific, and that is a lot in part because of the leadership that the Pacific has really shown in this area. The climate diplomacy skills of not only Pacific Island countries and their governments, but also the Pacific climate movement in really pushing for stronger climate action throughout the world. And really, without that leadership, we wouldn't have the 1.5 target in the Paris Agreement, which is so important for us to maintain and to use as our North Star in everything that we think of when we think of climate change, and particularly in terms of mitigation and achieving climate goals. We must make sure that we're aligning with 1.5, and that's really due to the leadership of the Pacific. So having COP in the region allows a lot more access for Pacific Islands delegations, and it also provides an opportunity for the Australian community to learn about climate change and how it's relevant, especially sort of like in a global sense, in a regional sense, and also what it means for Australia. I think a lot of Australians absolutely understand that climate change is already having a strong impact on them and their communities, particularly through multiple disasters that Australian communities have lived through, but also the fact that Australian First Nations communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are really bearing the brunt of climate change as well. So having that in Australia and that opportunity to center the leadership of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Pacific peoples and leaders really gives us an opportunity to bring that climate diplomacy, that storytelling, that mana to bear on the global climate negotiations. And it's also really an opportunity, we think, to encourage Australia to step up and do more. So we know that Australia, as one of the biggest fossil fuel emitters and exporters, has a long way to go to do better and in terms of climate action. And with the eyes of the world on Australia as the host and as the presidency of the COP, is an opportunity for Australia to really to do better, and an opportunity for those of us who campaign and who call for better, opportunity to invite them to step up and also hold the Australian government to account on that.
Those are all excellent reasons. I guess the headline issue of this COP is this international or new global finance pledge, which is absolutely crucial. This would build on the previous goal that was, I think, that expires next year, which was 100 billion a year. And that figure of $1 trillion is based on estimates of what's actually required, isn't it? It's not just a sort of figure plucked out of thin air. It's actually what is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. The global stocktake found that about 6 trillion is required for to support developing countries to implement NDCs. We also know that, and this is US dollars, 215 to up to $390 billion is required annually for adaptation in developing countries. So so that's every year up to 390 billion. And so the previous goal was talking about 100 billion a year. If you think about that $1 trillion each year to meet NDCs to halt climate change, catastrophic climate change, but also that hundreds of billions of dollars is required for adaptation. And then when you think about it as part of the renewable energy transformation, it found that we need $4 trillion for investments in clean energy worldwide every year to 2030. So exactly right. This is it's not a number pulled out of thin air, although of course it would be better to have much more than $1 trillion flowing into countries that need that support every year. But as a minimum, that $1 trillion should be the baseline.
A new global financial commitment is the headline issue. But can I ask you where you'll be focusing your energy and attention at this COP?
Yeah, so I have 3 main themes that I'll be focusing on in Baku at COP29. And that's really related to what WWF Australia has been working on in the climate space since the last COP. And that is number 1, Indigenous leadership, number 2, nature-based solutions, and number 3 is on industrial decarbonization. And so those are three key themes that my team within WWF Australia have been working on. And so why it's important to focus on Indigenous leadership is that Indigenous peoples have been the stewards of looking after country, looking after our earth for many beyond what a lot of us can even comprehend, and putting Indigenous people's leadership at the front and center and part of the global decision-making on anything to do with climate, biodiversity, and looking after the planet is to draw on those generations and hundreds of thousands of years of knowledge that can help to guide us in meeting our goals and into trying to avoid the crises that we are currently facing, or to mitigate them in some ways. So working with Indigenous people and within that making sure that uplifting community, uplifting women's voices is so important to making sure that with the solutions that we're finding are going to be the best fit for everyone, so that we're having just transitions. And so I'll be supporting some of our communities and partners to make sure that Indigenous leadership is really not only that people have a voice, but trying to find ways to make sure that voice translates into action and into the decision making that brings us these global outcomes. And so that's really super important, especially as we look forward to COP30 being in Brazil, and also having a focus on Indigenous peoples, and then taking that through from Brazil into a focus on Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Pacific leadership at COP31, and even possibly through to a COP in Africa for COP32, trying to make those linkages to have even more impact throughout. So that's working on Indigenous leadership and really helping to support our partners there. Nature-based solutions is my second focus. That's really looking to actions that use the power of nature to protect, manage, or restore ecosystems in a way that benefits people, nature, and climate. And of course, that's working hand in hand with Indigenous people, First Nations people from around the world, but really putting a focus on because nature-based solutions really bring so many benefits also to communities as well. So, for example, mangroves are such a huge way of helping communities to adapt to climate change. They help to protect against storm surges, for example, but they also are such an important part of creating healthy ocean ecosystems as well. And so going hand in hand, and mangroves absorb an incredible amount of carbon as well. So they're a sink too. So just an example of a nature-based solution there. And then WWF is also supporting industry in Australia on industry decarbonisation, and in particular steel decarbonisation. So, and we're working with our colleagues around the world as well on thinking about green metals corridors to work through trading partners to decarbonize the steel industry and other metals that are highly intensive, carbon intensive processes. So there's a lot of exciting opportunities there, and opportunities that for both Australia as well as for trading partners with incredible potential benefits for climate mitigation as well.
Those are three crucial priorities, very well chosen. Can I ask you, what are the main things working in favour of progress on those three issues at the COP? Are you hopeful of significant progress? And what are the potential barriers that have to be overcome?
I think on the side of centering Indigenous leadership, I and others have been very buoyed by what we saw coming out of COP16, the Convention on Biodiversity, the COP in Cali. So the CBD COP16 was a few weeks ago, and there was such a strong presence and global narrative about Indigenous people being so central to biodiversity. And as well, there's this growing recognition of the link between nature and climate, if you can even think of them as disconnected, as UN processes have different processes for nature, different processes for climate, but really there's this growing recognition that they are inherently intertwined, and that what's good for nature, for biodiversity, for the places that we love, and protecting them and having those natural places thriving is also good for addressing climate change, whether that be mitigation or adaptation. And so I think the opportunities there are for Indigenous leadership, and also connecting and building on the connections there. And WWF as a whole globally is advocating for a climate and nature work stream at COPs that would bring these more into alignment as well.
That would raise the profile of nature within the climate COP process. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it can sometimes be very focused on climate mitigation, for instance, which is obviously so important. But as we try and reduce emissions, we must also be making sure that that's done in a way that also protects nature and allows it to thrive as much as possible, while also addressing loss and damage, also addressing the very real need for communities to deal with the crises that are having very real impacts. And so, yeah, not downplaying the importance of reducing emissions, but absolutely bringing in so that we're talking in a more holistic manner. And of course, that is more in line as well with Indigenous thinking and approaches to these crises too.
There must be many organisations and individuals that you have dealt with virtually in your role at WWF and in your previous role at COP26 Climate Change Attaché. Will you get to meet many of them in person at the COP?
Yes, and that's one of the really beautiful things about it. It's a chance to actually get together and really work out some of the things that we've been talking about online, but also do that in a way that builds our relationships, and so that we're all stronger together. And so in terms of working with our partners on Indigenous leadership, that's absolutely fundamental to the way that we work. We've been having sort of weekly calls, but there are just things that haven't been able to be really worked out until people got here, and even for the past week before the COP kicks off, is the global conference on Indigenous peoples for climate change. And so that's happening right now and has been happening over the past few days. And that's where a lot of the people that I've been working with have been getting together and having some conversations that really get down into the details or kind of allow us to progress some of the things that we've been thinking about.
If I could ask you lastly, if there is one fact, or is there a particular fact that you wish more people knew about that would make it easier to focus our attention on taking steps towards a cleaner, greener, better world?
I think it's the fact that we can still do this. We can still, if we work hard, and if countries with a higher environmental footprint like Australia, if countries like Australia do more faster, we still have a chance to stabilize global warming to within 1.5 degrees. Yes, we may overshoot that goal, but in the very long term, it's possible if we act now to be able to bring that back. And that is such an important thing that we have to keep in mind. We have to keep 1.5 alive by doing everything that we can as fast as we can, but also in a way that's just, that's equitable, and we have to keep up that hope. The world is moving in the right direction, and yes, every point of a degree counts towards this, but we can still do this, and the difference between long-term 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is, in fact, the difference between under 2 degrees, possibly all coral reefs being completely wiped out, and with 1.5 degrees of warming, maintaining some of those coral reefs, and we know then that they may be able to carry forward from there. And so I think maintaining that hope, but also keeping in mind the difference that the small tenths of a degree can make. We can do it, but we must act now.
That's an inspiring answer and a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Kesaya.
Thank you, Murray. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Mark Tilley is Asia-Pacific editor of international news services Carbon Pulse and Biodiversity Pulse. And he's already chalked up 1 week in Azerbaijan, even though he's talking to me on the Sunday before the COP actually starts. Welcome, Mark, and how are things in Baku?
Hi, Mari. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. It's, Baku's a really fascinating place. I'm sure people will be hearing a lot more about it in the next 2 weeks.
Indeed. So there's no getting around it. The question that everybody is asking is, what impact will the US election result have on this COP? I'm sure it's a question that you and the Carbon Pulse team have been asking a lot of delegates and experts. What are you hearing? What sort of response are you getting to that question?
Yeah, well, I think the mood surrounding the COP29 talks has flipped in the wake of Donald Trump being re-elected. Before, there was a sense of optimism, at least on parts of the agenda of the talks. But now I think it's all been replaced with a lot of uncertainty and some pessimism. Trump has obviously vowed to remove the US from the Paris Agreement, as he has called climate change a hoax and a scam. However, the negotiating team in Baku will be run by President Biden's team. So there may be attempts from them to shore up as much of the US's stances and agreements as possible in the next 2 weeks. That being said, some have argued that it will be hard to take the US negotiators at their word, and they'll be seen as something of a lame duck because it's highly likely so many of their actions will be unwound next year once President Trump gets into office in January. So this COP has been given the nickname of the Finance COP, basically because at the top of the agenda is the new collective quantified climate goal, or NCQG, on climate finance.
Yep.
So this is basically a pledge by developed countries on how much public and private finance developed countries will give developing countries each year to combat climate change. This new pledge is designed to replace the existing one, which was made in 2009, which promised that $100 billion per year of finance would be provided by 2020, which developed countries did not achieve until 2022. There are a lot of numbers flying around about how much the new goal should be, $1 trillion, $2 trillion per year. Obviously, to reflect the reality that climate impacts are getting increasingly worse, and the world needs to act faster given that the goal of keeping global temperatures at or below 1.5 degrees is becoming increasingly out of reach. A real sticking point for these talks will be who will provide the cash and in what form this funding will take. Developing countries want the cash to be in grants rather than loans, given that they're trying to avoid increasing their public debt, which they argue is not a sustainable way to fund action on climate change. But how countries are defined as being developing or not is also going to be incredibly difficult, given that the list the UN process relies on was set back in the 1990s and doesn't reflect the rapid industrialization and development in many countries since that time. So countries like China, Singapore, and the UAE, for example. Developed countries have also pushed for finance to be provided from as wide an array of sources as possible, such as the private sector and multilateral development organizations like the World Bank. Others have also pointed to things like carbon taxes, acknowledging or making note of the idea that cash should be provided on a polluter pays principle. So there are a lot of open questions that will need to be answered over the next 2 weeks on this.
And have we got many clues as to where things might be heading? Of those, what of the many options that are out there are considered possible?
Well, there's still a lot of open questions. There seems to be some convergence towards a structure for the NCQG with 2 layers, the first layer being public finance and the second being all other sources. But there's still significant uncertainty on the specific number that they will land on in terms of what that figure should specifically be. So yeah, it's still an open question, very much. But then there's also the second major issue at this round of talks, which is going to be on Article 6, which is the UN-backed global carbon crediting framework. There was a lot of optimism on this in the lead up to the COP, with many expecting that the issues that had seen this scheme being held up over the last 2 years being resolved. Things like the role of an international registry, rules around the authorization and revocations of credit transactions, transparency measures, these all still need to be resolved. It's very, very technical, tricky stuff. But there did seem to be hope that all of this could be put to rest in Baku over the next 2 weeks. However, as I said at the top, the result of the US election has created a lot of questions around the overall ambition of what this COP can achieve, given the world's second largest polluter and a crucial part of this international process will now begin to withdraw from all of this again. This has led to some to speculate whether talks will simply break down because of countries' inability to reach consensus, given that a lack of agreement on finance could have the knock-on effect negotiations and agreements in other rooms about other matters, such as Article 6. So, yeah, things are deeply uncertain.
A high level of uncertainty. One of the things that occurs to me, though, is negotiators must have been hoping for a different result, but they must have planned for this possibility. It's not like it seemed an inconceivable result. Surely negotiators had been working on a plan B, or basically a plan R, a plan Republican. Surely they've thought about how they can solve these issues, given that the US won't be at the table.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think it's entirely all doom and gloom. One source noted to me a couple of weeks ago that we have seen this show before, obviously with Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement in 2016 when he was elected the first time. Countries around the world in 2016 realized that they needed to form this sort of coalition of the willing to continue to push, even though the US was backing out. So this time around, other countries and regions like the EU or even China could step up to fill the void in global climate leadership that would be left once the US does back out. As a side note, Australia will find out at this COP whether it has won its bid to host COP31 in 2026. So if it is successful, theoretically, you could argue that, or you would think that the US back down on climate would mean that Australia would have to become much more ambitious with its climate agenda in order to live up to its expectations as a COP host and a developed, rich nation in anticipation for 2026. And obviously, the fact that the US is backing out of the Paris Agreement doesn't mean that climate action everywhere grinds to a halt. The world and the economics of the energy transition are at a very, very different place to where it was in 2016, with the rollout of renewable energy, batteries and electric vehicles globally, and particularly in places like China, happening at a much faster pace than we previously anticipated. There's also the fact that the Biden administration's massive climate spending bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, is primarily seeing investment and development going into Republican-held states and is widely popular among the private sector. So despite Trump's vows to tear up climate spending and agreements, his cuts and pullbacks may not be as devastating as he has previously made it out to be. But obviously, with all these things, it's incredibly hard to predict what's going to happen next.
Yeah, exactly. I must say, last time, I think this is correct, he stepped away from it all, but it wasn't really an interfering role. They were absent, basically, which is a big problem, but at least they weren't meddlesome, destructively meddlesome.
Yeah. And I think obviously last time around, I think it was a 3-year process to walk away from the COP, to pull out of COP, but this time it's only 1. So maybe that will give more time for other countries to step up, or maybe it could mean the opposite happens and things continue to break down. Things do break down, but it's, as I say, it's really hard to say with all of this, especially right now when a lot of people in this space are basically still sort of digesting this election result. Well, we just came off the back of the COP16 talks on biodiversity in Cali, Colombia, and those talks were cut short because leaders at the COP physically had to leave because it was going into overtime and they all had to catch their flights to leave the country, basically to go home. I think that was the place where all of this sort of nexus between biodiversity and climate was sort of meant to be hashed out. But I don't think. But I mean, there was a lot of positive sentiment and a lot of mobilization, but I don't think they really were able to deal with the. They weren't able to resolve some of the toughest issues on those talks in terms of specific funding commitments. And that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure how much of that will be on this agenda in Baku, but so yeah,
we'll have to wait and see. I guess because I'm desperately looking for a bit of a silver lining, Mark. But I guess one other issue, I mean, in terms of trying to get the administration to engage, one of the challenges that Australia, Europe, the US, Canada, other nations have been engaged in has been developing alternative supply chains, for example, for critical minerals and green commodities to reduce reliance on China, basically. I mean, that could still be a motivating factor for the second Trump administration. It's certainly been very wary of China, and that those sorts of issues, strengthening supply chains, green supply chains, is there a chance that that could be something that would still be of interest to this next administration?
It really depends on whether, I suppose, the new administration sees it to be in its interests or not. I think the administration under Trump has been seen to be sort of very transactional, but it's. I think perhaps maybe not so much with critical minerals and the like, but I think the emphasis on technologies like carbon capture and storage, whether you believe it is a viable climate solution or not. I think that will be a continued focus of spending potentially under a Trump administration, basically because it's favorable and wants to be explored and continued by the energy sector and the oil and gas sector particularly. So, we could see continued development and funding on something like that. But in terms of how this whole plays out with terms of international supply chains relating to the energy transition, I think it's really hard to say right now, given, this whole plan of imposing tariffs on the world, basically. So it's hard to see how much of that's going to work at this stage, I think.
Yeah. Okay, and I guess just one final question. I mean, how quickly will we get a clear picture of what sort of impact the election is having? Will it be a matter of waiting to see that final document, when it comes out at the close of the talks? Or will there be, do you expect that we'll see, a bit of a vibe about it all somewhat earlier? In the first few days. For example, leaders' statements, I presume they've all been furiously rewritten over the last few days.
Obviously, leaders and negotiators are all sort of starting to fly in,
yes,
and starting to hit the ground. So I think it'll become quite apparent.
All right, terrific. Thanks so much, Mark, and good luck with covering it all. And it's a big job. There's a lot to cover. I know you'll be flat out, and appreciate you taking the time. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Murray. I'd like to give a shout out to my Carbon Pulse colleagues, Roy Manuel and Sarah Stefanini, whose reporting helps inform this segment. So
wonderful.
Thank you to them.
Yep.
And thanks to you, Murray. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always good to catch up. Talk soon, Mark. I hope you've enjoyed this first COP29 episode of Track Changes, and I'll be back again soon with another episode. See you next time.